Now, today I wanted to do the last in these series of brief videos explaining the book, The Rediscovery of the Human. This is a book which deals with the work of Viktor Frankl and also incorporates quite strongly in an introduction at all events, because the essays are all works of Viktor Frankl, but it also in the introduction draws heavily on the work of Freud and the reclamation of Freud, the way in which Freud could be used in a way which is harmonious with that of Viktor Frankl, even though you have the paradox that Frankl's work was ostensibly antithetical to that of Freud, or Freud's antithetical to that of Frankl, because one was theistic and one was not. One believed the human being had a higher faculty, a conscience, a soul, and the other did not. At all events, nevertheless, we see that they can be brought together. But today, I want to bring out how it is that it is the religious tradition specifically, what Frankl himself called the higher dimension, which enables this integration of the work of Viktor Frankl and Sigmund Freud to be accomplished. Now, it's this tradition which Frankl acknowledged, the religious tradition, which is so important to the rediscovery of the human. And this expression, the rediscovery of the human, is chosen with the knowledge and sense that psychology, certainly most of the psychology, most of the principal psychological theories before Frankl, and unfortunately since Frankl too, have excluded a contemplation of the spiritual faculty of the human being. And this, they might say, is scientifically necessary because we're not here to offer views. There's no ethical component to it. There's no ethical teaching associated with psychology, people might say. But, and they might also say that it's not scientific to or therapeutically appropriate to have a background which involves an ethical or a moral foundation. However, if this is done, if this position, if this what I call this doctrinaire secularism is adopted, you in fact end up with a truncated concept of what the human being is. Because if one says, I do not see the soul, because I cannot, it doesn't appear under a MRI, it doesn't come up on an imaging screen, or I can't see this, then unfortunately you're using a very limited instrumentation, because there are lots of things we cannot see. You can't see mind in a philosophical sense either. You can't see heart in a philosophical sense either. It's not a piece of tissue. It's not an organ. It's more than that. It's an emotional complex. But at all events, a view of the human being which excludes the soul is one which is A, incomplete, to put it mildly, and B, deeply prejudices the adequate treatment of the human being. Because the human being, most human beings, some 84% of humanity are religious. And if psychology insists that this is irrelevant, then unfortunately that is a deficit both for psychology and its patients. As I mentioned on one previous occasion, that a survey was taken in Australia in a mental hospital, and some 2/3 of the patients wanted a spiritual component in their therapy, whilst 10% of the treating psychologists and psychiatrists were prepared to give it. So you see here, unfortunately, a major discrepancy between what the human being believes and feels and knows him or herself to be, and what much of psychology has regarded the human being. And so therefore, the whole purpose of this exercise is to lead psychology itself back to a rediscovery of the human, and to find out who the human being really is, and to acknowledge, hopefully, that the human being actually also includes a spiritual component, and this is a reality, not a fantasy. Now, this idea of the soul is also very important, because Not only does the soul or the spiritual dimension, the higher dimension, the inclusive dimension, as Frankl called it, tell us what a human being is, tell us about what the metaphysics of personality. In other words, what a human being is, that a human being is not just a mind and a body, but also a spirit. But it also tells us that there is an ethical dimension to an ethical dimension to human personality. There is a moral structure to human personality. To put it very crudely, a wife beater, heaven forbid, is not a healthy person. The person, no matter what kind of a face, no matter what kind of a wonderful executive that person is at work, there is something which is deficient in that personality. There is if we say that personality is something devoid of moral and ethical criteria, then we are actually mistaking what health is. The fact that a guard in a Nazi concentration camp can come home after a day of unbelievable atrocities, to put on his slippers and listen to Mozart, that doesn't mean that that person is a healthy person, because he is a high functioner in other realms. In other words, we say that the ethical dimension is important also in determining the norms of psychological wellness. So this basic concept that religion tells us who the human being is. It also tells us what the healthy human being is, and this must be something of which psychology takes note. And if psychology is afraid to do this because it itself is bedeviled by a moral relativism, then that unfortunately is itself an expression of a collective neurosis, of a pathology of the zeitgeist, which has infected psychology. Psychology merges into moral relativism. Then psychology itself, unfortunately, becomes an instrument of harm. It becomes an instrument it becomes something which contributes to psychological illness rather than something which helps it. Okay, this is something which obviously needs exploration, but I'm drawing your attention here to the various sources, the way in which these themes can be documented in the work of Frankl and Freud, Freud reclaimed and reconstituted. Now, let's now look and see how it is that the religious tradition is able to unite such disparate figures, and how it was able to unite such disparate figures as Viktor Frankl, who held that the human being has a soul, and that this is the primary faculty in the human being, and a person like Freud, who seemed to have said the very opposite, that the essential person is the instinctual person who rejected the soul, and so on and so on. Now, this essentially is a recap, or sort of like, if you like, a systematization of what has been said until now. But we find that a great seminal figure in the religious tradition, the Maharal of Prague, Rabbi Yehuda Lerva of Prague, and also a great deal of subsequent theology, particularly this is Hasidic thought and so on and so forth, explicates and provides us with the framework to how we can bring Freud and Frankl together around an ethical model of personality. Well, first of all, let's do this all through the great figure of the Maharal of Prague. First of all, the Maharal of Prague is, as a pure theologian, one who tells us what it is that the soul is, if you like, spiritually and ethically. And and when we look at the soul of humanity, what is called the divine likeness in the human being, what this religiosity in humanity is all about. And remember, it's some 84% of humanity which is acknowledging this and saying this about itself, is that the soul is primarily that which is committed to ethical deed. What is the essence of faith? The essence of faith is the proof of faith is the willingness to act, the willingness to do. before and prior to and after all contemplation, all feeling, and so on. What the essence of faith is attachment to God. And that, in other words, that which raises the human being above his or her own experienced interests and desires, wants, perceptions, and says, this is what you have to do. This is how you imitate God. This is how you cleave to God. And this, and so that essentially then, this notion of this ethical structure, if you like, of the soul exists in what Frankl called the imitation of God, which means the imitation of God's ways, ethical ways. And it's the Noahide laws which constitute this universal template of the human soul, which the human soul translates into and expresses itself through ethical deed based on the Noahide laws. Now, that's what the soul is about, essentially, to cleave to God through imitation of God's ways. Frankl himself said it. Now, and that's the innermost essence of the human being. Now, when we look at the work of Viktor Frankl himself is his work, his logotherapy, is very much what it does is it takes the three dimensions of personality, mind, body, and soul, and looks at it primarily through the instrument of intellect. Because Frankl's logotherapy was very much a therapy in which called the human being to analysis of its situation, analysis of its own predicament, analysis of its mental and emotional responses to various circumstances. And we've seen how, and this is elaborated in the first two chapters of the introduction to the book, how this dovetails in an amazing way with a model by the Maharal of Prague of the structure of personality, how it is that these different departments of human personality, mind, body, and soul, in the personal, which means the relation between the human and God, interpersonal, between person and person, how the various fields of this matrix of personality essentially delineate a correspondence between these departments of personality and ethical action. Intellect, for example, balanced, refined, ethical intellect is one which negates idolatry, is one which negates injustice, because these are defects, so to speak, in intellect itself. Refined emotion is one which by its very nature negates coarse self-gratification, the realm of lust, the ability of some sort of sexual morality, or an abstinence from theft. In other words, there are controls on raw desire. And how it is similarly also that the noetic faculty, or the higher faculty of the human being, is something which comes to proper attunement in behavior which acknowledges, on hand which acknowledges God, and the second, and is also directed away from acts such as killing and the destruction of that which bears the stamp and implant of God, which is human life. And then and it goes further, but at all of it, Frankl looks at the whole of human being, human personality, all three dimensions, through the primary lens of intellect, and the Maharal of Prague enables us to systematize essentially what Frankl is also saying. And that Frankl himself said, I got it from the Maharal of Prague. That's one thing. So the Maharal of Prague now enables us to tie in Viktor Frankl's intellectual analysis of personality and to correlate it with the soul, to correlate it with because the Noahide laws map in. He shows how the Noahide laws map into the different departments of human personality to give them their right balance and orientation. And then we went to Freud. Well, Freud, as we thought, it has an emotional or an instinctual take on the three dimensions of personality: ego, and superego. And he places different attributes, or he calls it different instinctual complexes, in each of these departments. And this concept of relating attributes of attributes, qualities, modalities, let's call it qualities to the different departments of intellect, of the personality, I should say. This is something which the Maharal of Prague also does. The Maharal of Prague takes these qualities, for example, eros, or let's talk, or thanatos, narcissus, as Freud calls it, and he actually says, he gives them the names of their purified forms as divine attributes, not coarse attributes as they are in Freud, but a refined love, a refined discipline, a refined glorification of God instead of self-glorification. Now, all of these things, Freud, the Maharal shows how this, if you like, this attribute-based view of the human personality, which was that of Freud, is something which can also be correlated to the Noahide laws, because the Noahide laws also, the 7 Noahide laws, also correspond to these 7 attributes, which Freud elaborated 3 of them, the three primary attributes. But these correlate also to the Noahide laws. So basically what we see through the Maharal of Prague is how the soul, which is which is modeled on the Noahide laws, the imitation of God, can, on the one hand, give an intellectual, can give an intellectual correlate, can correlate with the personality seen through the intellectual lens of Frankl, and also can correlate with the human personality seen through the attribute teaching, or the emotional position, the view of Freud. So that's a very potted summary. It's all set out in the book, but it was without the religious position, without the religious tradition, we would not have been able really to bring Freud and Frankl together. And we would not be able to, in a sense, to redeem Freud. They'd redeem an ostensibly anti-religious thinker and make his work valid under transposition for integration with the logotherapy of Viktor Frankl. At all events, this is something which is quite extraordinary, and we have to realize that Frankl said something very important when he said that the theology, in a sense, is the encompassing and the inclusive view for psychology. Psychology has its own integrity and its own professionalism as a group of techniques and working theories for the human being. But if it will not make proper cognizance of what the human being is, that is to say, body, mind, and soul, then it in fact can only produce a partial or a distorted view of the human being. So this is a very important thing. First and foremost, we have to ask the most basic questions. What is a human being? Whilst a medical doctor might not need to know so much that there is a soul, the psychologist must, because we're talking about the whole consciousness of the human being, the ethical human being. The human being is not being seen as a piece of nature, a body. The human being is grasped in his or her full complexity as body, mind, and soul. And without this perspective, psychology, unfortunately, can, instead of being of assistance, be of the opposite to us. Now, I want finally to bring out how the work of Frankl and the work of transformed and reclaimed Freud revealed different levels of the harmony and integration of personality. And I'll start with this first of all by introducing some theological concepts, which are not so far from our understanding, the regular understanding. And basically, there is the idea that a person can have the relationship of mind and body, mind and emotion. First of all, it's quite possible that we know, all of us, most of us know, that we have to review and check our own impulses. We are human beings. We are not wholly refined human beings. We may have achieved a degree of refinement, but we constantly have to watch ourselves and check ourselves lives. That's what it is to be a human being. That's what responsibility is all about. We are capable of sudden impulses, sudden feelings, sudden emotions, and our purpose is to review these emotions, to examine them, to check them where they need to be checked, to modify them where they need to be modified. That's one level of human development. And hopefully most people have that. Maybe, I don't know, what in contemporary culture, it could be that it's like it's a pathology of the times that unfortunately the non-responsibility, non-control of emotions, in fact, is elevated to a norm, particularly with the incredible doctrines being sent around now in gender fluidity. Unfortunately, we have the notion that emotion and mere emotion and perception is more authoritative than anything else. That itself is an authority, and that the human beings should allow themselves to be driven by mere perception, mere impulse. This is staggering. So, but the traditional concept is that the human being has a review of emotion and perception and is able to adjudicate and say, this is good, this is not good. I need help with this. I need to make my feelings match up to a norm. And I may need help with it. I may have trauma. I may have all sorts of issues, but I need assistance with this. I need to be able to bring my feelings and my perceptions into alignment with my conscience. My conscience is the highest authority in me and the most authentic authority. Anyway, so basically then, speaking about what the religious tradition understands as normality, a regular normality is that the mature, healthy individual is able to check and review emotional impulse and perception, and to examine it, and to just decide whether or not to reject it based on higher norms. Now, that's one level. That's one level. That's where we see. But there is an even higher level in human development than that. And this higher level is a very special one. And we may, in this individual's merit to a degree of this in our own lives. And that is that emotions cease to be, if you like, engaged in a battle with our thoughts and our higher sense of what's right. In other words, sometimes we can accomplish in varying degrees an actual refinement of our emotions. The emotions no longer become unruly. The emotions no longer become something which we have to struggle with, something which we have to check, but our emotions become themselves become refined. We have refined feelings towards others, not feelings which I have to repress. To the contrary, the emotions themselves are something which have, if you like, have their separate connection to the soul. Because normally, if we look at their work, it's a hierarchy. First of all, there is our higher knowledge of what's right and what's wrong. It's a spiritual knowledge, a knowledge of conscience. And then beneath that comes in intellect. Intellect has a special role to play because intellect can control emotion. So what happens is conscience informs intellect, and intellect deals with the main opposition, which comes from emotion. So it's conscience, intellect, emotion, down like that. It's a chain of command. People don't like the word command these days, but nevertheless, that's what it is. And that at all events, that's because emotion is below intellect. The higher people as a level of higher personal development, we can actually modify our emotions. So our intellect, it's in some ways the emotions stand on the same level as intellect. Emotions are also modeling themselves on the soul, just like intellect does. And in that particular case, that's a great step because our natures lead us towards what's good. Our nature has been transformed. And the spiritual tradition uses two words. In the language of the mystical tradition of the Zohar, there's an expression called iskafia, which means checking, binding. And there's another expression called ishapcha, which means transformation. Now, the first level, where we have to check our emotions through intellect under the information and auspices of the soul, that is called binding, checking, controlling, reining it in. Then there is the other level of called transformation. My emotions have become pure and refined by themselves, and they don't have to be reined into the same degree. Or they may, and in fact, sometimes my emotions might even be more refined than my intellect in certain ways. I might have my much more, my sentiments might be more pure sometimes than what my mind can actually direct it. At all events, these two levels are brought out in the two encounters between some great rabbinic figures and Frankl and Freud themselves. Well, let's go in order. So Viktor Frankl, as we know, his work was there to bring out that primary level, that more basic level, how mind can check emotion under the aegis of the soul. And there he received actually very strong encouragement from a great rabbinic leader of our time, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson. Frankl, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, as you've known, had actually recommended Frankl's work to many people, pointing out how it is in fact important that a person learn to bridle unruly emotion and feeling, perceptions, and so on and so forth. And this is actually a key to psychological health. And in a matter of fact, in the Lubavitcher Rebbe actually was very important to Viktor Frankl personally also in this work. We know that, as I may have mentioned on an earlier occasion, or maybe I didn't mention it at all, so I'm mentioning it now for the first time, that Frankl became deeply despondent because his work was not being taken very seriously. He was not having any success in the professional and academic world. Freudianism was reigning supreme, and people didn't like his concept of the soul, the conscience, and so on and so forth. And Frankl even came to the point where he had actually written a letter of resignation from the University of Vienna, which would have been a very saddened thing because he had decades of tremendous work ahead of him. At that moment, it says that actually somebody came and knocked on the door and said, hello, how are you? He said, I have a greetings from the Lubavitcher Rebbe in New York for you. He was bringing a message to Frankl. He had this lady, actually, she had other things to do as well, but one of the things was Frankl, and this lady informed Frankl that the Lubavitcher Rebbe knew, I said that you must not give up. You must continue. And apparently Freud just collapsed. So Frankl just collapsed into a chair and wept when he heard this, because he was on the point of giving up, and he'd been supported and strengthened by the Lubavitcher Rebbe at the last moment. That was an astonishing thing. Anyway, but whatever it was, the late Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, did in fact crucially encourage Frankl in his work, and particularly in this line, as we mentioned before, this notion that the moral regulation of feeling and impulse is very important to mental health, and the Frankl's approach is very important. And all then there is the second story. The second story, which I've elaborated a little bit earlier, which is discussed at greater length in the book, is the meeting between another Lubavitcher, the fifth Lubavitcher, as it happens, and Freud. And at that meeting, Freud spoke utterly uncharacteristically with an analysis of that fifth Lubavitcher, and about which he spoke and said how it was that emotion can sometimes be dissatisfied with intellect, and intellect can sometimes be dissatisfied with emotion. And the reason for this is, he said this with reference to that fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe himself, was that he saw in this person how emotion itself had been utterly purified. In other words, when emotion stands at exactly the same level as when emotion is as authoritative in the human being as intellect itself, because it's purer. So then emotion can be unhappy with intellect, because the emotion demands an attachment to God, which the intellect sometimes doesn't have to, is not able to supply, or a perception. And conversely, when the intellect is so refined, it can also have a knowledge of God, which it feels that intellect is not meeting up to. Anyway, this was a picture of transformed and refined emotion. At all events, we're talking now. This leads us really